Welcome to the world of Mark's Money Mind, coming to you this week from home base in Longmont, Colorado. I'm your host, Mark Troutman. This educational personal finance show combines money lessons, timely topics, personal stories, and community wisdom to help listeners and viewers master their finances to enjoy a stress-free life of financial freedom. Happy Memorial Day weekend. I am back from a big trip. I was in French Polynesia and Hawaii. We flew to French Polynesia and were there for a couple days, then got on a cruise ship, bopped around to a few islands in French Polynesia, and then took a 5-day sea voyage to Hawaii, and then bopped around there a little bit, and then another 5 days to California, where I met up with some of the slackers in Encinitas, California. Sorry for the big publishing gap. My time was pretty much consumed by socialization with friends and enjoying all these great new places and taking the time to produce a podcast, which I do all by myself without any assistance, seemed like it would just take away from that precious time enjoying life to its fullest in locations that I may never visit again. I really enjoyed French Polynesia. It's one of my favorite places now in the world that I've visited. I plan to go back for a much longer visit in the future. I've already made some of those plans. And I would say if you are a beach or water lover looking for kind of a laid-back atmosphere, I would highly recommend you put it at the top of your travel list. And it goes to say that I wouldn't be doing all this traveling in retirement if I didn't set myself up for financial independence starting at a relatively young age, not the youngest age that I could have, but at a young age nonetheless, which brings us to today's topic. I was at an event here in Longmont at the Mr. Money Mustache headquarters where we were getting together for an individual's retirement party. And I was having a nice long conversation with a couple, and the one individual was thinking about how they could set up their children for financial freedom, potentially financial independence at a relatively young age. And I was having this conversation, and it was quite involved, and we had some ideas that we were throwing around. I was giving some of my history and how I was able to do that for my daughter and also to some extent for my nieces and nephews. And he also owns his own company, so he has the option of employing them potentially. Of course, we discussed that it needed to be actual employment, doing something that was necessary for the business, and he has plenty of that as a sole proprietor. There's a lot to do and a lot that I believe they're teenagers, would be able to do above board. It's not just paying, a child for a picture on a website, for example, which is a little questionable in my opinion. This is true actual work. So my daughter overheard some of this conversation and said, hey, this would make a really good podcast episode. So why don't you do that for the first one that you come back on board and talk about that a little bit. So I want to talk about, let me back up a little bit. I'll share some of the things that I was able to do for my daughter, my nieces and nephews. I think I've shared this before, but my wife and I thought about funding my daughter's college education ever since she was born, really actually slightly before she was born. And we kind of mathed out how much would we need to put away in an account on a monthly basis for it to accumulate enough between the contributions and the potential gains to pay for a 4-year college degree at most likely a state level college or a state cost college. And we kind of mathed it out, and we used pretty conservative assumptions for the rates of return. And we did that for the entire 18 years prior to her going to college. We actually kind of super funded it a little bit in 2008 and 9. She was about 8 or 9 at the time. And with the markets going down so much, we decided to kind of move some of those contributions forward, which in hindsight was a great thing. We didn't know if it would all work out, but with the market being down so much, it seemed like an opportune time to super fund it a little bit. And so we got ahead of ourselves. So we didn't quite have to contribute the full 18 years, but we did contribute the amount we decided to do for the full 18 years. And it worked out great. It actually ended up being more than enough to pay for the actual 5 years of school she went to, because she got her master's from a state university, Colorado State University, go Rams. And there was still some money left over. So I really thought about this from the standpoint of it was a nest egg to help start her financial freedom journey. And it was something that we were fortunate to be able to do. She did not use all the money for school, so there was a nice nest egg to start. I'm pretty sure I've shared that before. And a number of people that I've shared it with that, I've mentioned or I've talked at Camp FIs before. My daughter actually has spoken with me at a Camp FI, I think it was in 2023, I want to say. And we talked a little bit about this. And a lot of people have come up to me and said, so how do I do this? What's the best way to kind of launch a young individual, kind of the next generation, and kind of set them up for success? And that's what we were talking about at the meetup this other weekend, or this past, I don't think it was last weekend, I think it was the weekend before. And the individual was asking about, because somebody else had introduced him to me saying, hey, Mark probably has some ideas on this because he's done this for his daughter. And I do want to add one other thing. I did it to some degree for my nieces and nephews. And the other individual that was in the conversation has said they've done the same thing. What my wife and I decided to do for our nieces and nephews, and we didn't start it when the oldest nephew and niece were born, but for the ones that came along later, we did start this kind of at birth. That was the goal once we kind of figured this out. So the idea was, instead of contributing or buying some kind of birthday or Christmas gift, which we did, but it just wasn't to the degree that we might have normally, so it might be a small gift instead of a larger gift, we decided to contribute a small amount to, at the time, it was a custodial brokerage account. So I or my wife were the custodian of the account. The minor was the person whose account it was, and we contributed a very small amount to the account at every birthday and every Christmas or holiday period. And I believe, I want to say it was $50 each time or $100 a year. So we're not talking huge dollars here by any means, but the idea was to show them how compounding works in real life. And the idea was, and this is what we ended up doing because they're all now over the age of 21, at the age of majority, in most states it's 21 and some it's 18, but in all of their states it was 21, we would give them these accounts, or in essence, take our name off as custodian, and they would be their own accounts, and kind of show them how this small amount of money put away for many years compounded to quite a bit of money over time. This was before we were well-versed in things like Roth IRAs, and certainly a young individual who's of non-working age wouldn't be able to contribute to Roth anyway. But so we used custodial accounts. And I want to say these accounts grew to quite a bit of money. I want to say it might have been somewhere around $3,000 or $6,000, depending on the time frame and how many years we contributed and things like that. And it was also very interesting to see what they did with this. And what I learned was the people, or the nieces and nephews that were closest to us, continued to invest that money. In many cases, they used it to fund their Roth IRAs in early years. So they sold out of the custodial brokerage account and moved that money into a Roth IRA, for example. Others used it for things like paying down student debt, or I think somebody might have used it for a down payment on a house, if I recall, or a portion of a down payment. But the idea was to show how compounding works. And I know the ones that have the Roth IRA still, I'm presuming, because I've had some conversations with them, but I'm not going to speak for them, that they have realized how valuable or how much that compounding really has worked going forward, because they have now used it to seed their Roth IRAs, which brings me back to the discussion that I was having with the individual at the meetup. And his idea was, he has his own business, like I said, was hiring his children to do actual work and use that money to fund their Roth IRAs. And we were talking about logistically, how would you do that? There's a couple of options. Since he's a sole proprietor, they could be potentially 1099 employees. Of course, that means they have to be in control of their time and how they do the work. But he could say something to the effect of, here's what I need you to do. You figure out the time and place to do it, and then deliver that work back to me, and then invoice me for your time, and I will pay you. I will then send you a 1099, and that is earned income, and that earned income could be utilized to fund a Roth IRA, for example. I've also talked about this to my students in the financial literacy class I do, and I also think this is a great time to talk about this, because here we are, Memorial Day weekend. School is getting out. Many students are graduating from high school, or at least finishing their year up in high school or college, and are going to be potentially working in the summer. And so this is a great time to think about how, as the later generation, let's say you're their parent or they're your niece or nephew, how you might be able to instill the idea of saving and investing for the future with some or part of those earnings. And what you could also do potentially, I've seen some parents do this, for example, is let's say a child earns, I don't know, $3,000 over the course of the summer, and they may say, hey, I am going to contribute some money to your Roth IRA, either in a matching form. So maybe the child will put, let's say, $1,000 in the Roth IRA, and the parent will match it. I've seen some match 1-to-1. I've seen some do 2-to-1. What we ended up doing, since my daughter initially had custodial accounts and later we started funding her 529 in the second half of our kind of funding period for her, and that's what was used for school, but she ended up having some money in a custodial account. And so what we did was, when she would make money in the summer, or actually she would work sometimes during the year too while she was in school, whether it was high school or college, we would say, hey, let's take some of the money in your custodial account, move it over to the Roth IRA based on the income you've earned for the year, because you can contribute up to $7,000 a year, or your income for the year. For example, a student, let's say, makes $3,000. They can't contribute the full $7,000 to the Roth, but they could contribute what they earned that year, which in that case would be $3,000. So if she made $3,000 in the summer, we would say, hey, let's move $3,000 from your custodial account, in essence, by selling shares, raising cash, and then making a deposit into the Roth IRA, and get that into an account where it can earn gains or capital gains, because they were in equities, for example, long term with no tax consequences going forward. So that was a great way to fund her Roth IRA, and we've basically been helping her do that ever since she has started to earn income. Another thing to think of, some people will say, well, how do you do this if a child or a niece or nephew is not earning a W-2 wage? Of course, if, like, I'm going to use my daughter as an example, she worked at the local ice cream store and they paid her a W-2. And of course, there's a W-2 at the end of the year that she files a tax return. Now she's not going to be paying much in taxes, because as long as her income was below the standard deduction, she isn't going to pay any federal income tax. She may owe some state income tax. But because of the standard deduction and being below that, there really isn't any federal tax. But you do need to file the tax return, and that's a good way for the IRS to track that you actually did have income in order to validate that you are contributing to a Roth IRA. So it's fairly straightforward in that case. But what about if your child, niece, nephew, what have you, has their own kind of, let's say, side business. Maybe they babysit or do pet sitting or pet walking. Or I had a friend in school when I was very young, and he was very industrious, and he had his own lawn care company, for example. Or in today's day and age, maybe your children or niece or nephew are doing graphic design on the side. I've seen that. Or even social media management. The key is those are all legitimate businesses with legitimate income. Now, some people won't report that income, and I would suggest, A, you're supposed to report that income, and B, it's beneficial to report that income because that opens the door to be able to contribute to a Roth IRA. Now, here's the thing about that. You're going to want to have good records. So if you're babysitting, let's say, create an invoice. It can be handwritten. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Hand it to the individual who pays you. Now you have a record of invoicing someone for that work, or pet sitting, or lawn care, or graphic design, or social media, or any of those examples. Have a tracking mechanism where you're invoicing, you're receiving the money, and then when it comes to tax time, you will fill out what's called Schedule C, or they will. They will actually have their own tax return. They will fill out Schedule C, and it may have all the income that they've received, and any potential expenses can be subtracted from that. So let's say you have a lawn care business. You can subtract potentially, certainly gas. Now, of course, maybe you have an electric lawnmower, but any costs associated with that business, direct costs associated with that business. And then the net income that you earn from that business is eligible to be able to justify the contribution to the Roth IRA. Now, here's the thing. Because you are reporting it, as you should, on Schedule C, there are going to be some taxes associated with that, which is basically FICA tax, which is Social Security and Medicare taxes, which everyone that receives a W-2 sees them subtracted from their own income. However, when you receive a W-2, you are only paying half of that. You're paying the employee portion of FICA. There is also an employer portion, which is not shown on the W-2, but it's the same amount. And when you have your own business, you get the great benefit of paying both the employer and the employee portion. So that is something to consider. And certainly when you set your rate for these services, keep that in mind. You want to make sure that you're setting it appropriately to account for that. But this would then give you the ability to report your income. Like I said, it's unless they're over $15,000, which is the current standard deduction for a single, plus you get an extra $450 if you're filing as a dependent child. So a total of $15,450. Please check that. Make sure that that is the actual rate. That is what it is as of this recording. And again, it's always good to double check that. But if you were making less than that in your small business or any other income you receive, non-investment income, then you wouldn't be paying any federal income tax. But you still do have to pay the FICA taxes, the Social Security and Medicare taxes. This is also a really good teaching opportunity. It's kind of showing people or young people how you run a business and keeping good records, understanding your true expenses, direct expenses, as well as taxes like the FICA, for example. And this is a really good opportunity for a young individual to kind of learn business in a way. I think it's also beneficial from that standpoint. So why consider a Roth IRA instead of just putting it in a brokerage account or a savings account? Well, the benefit of the Roth IRA is that, again, the downside is the money you put in there is already taxed income. But as a young individual who's not really being taxed on this income, it's kind of a free entry into the Roth IRA. For most people, they have to think, Do I want to go ahead and pay the taxes on this money and put it in a Roth IRA? Or do I want to take a tax deduction and put it in the traditional IRA component? And that's more of a decision. But when you're not paying any tax on the money to begin with, the Roth is hands down the best way to go if you're putting it in a retirement account. And the money in that account is going to grow tax-free forever. It is a huge, huge benefit for those who have a very long time frame, such as a young individual. The other benefit of the Roth IRA, and again, they probably wouldn't be considering a traditional IRA anyway because there is no benefit to a tax deduction when you're not paying taxes. But the other benefit is that I like to think of it this way. A Roth IRA is like the annual contribution amount is like a window that is open every year and shuts. And then the next year, the new window opens. You can only push $7,000 through that window in any 1 year, and then that window closes. You have no opportunity to go back in time and say, hey, I didn't contribute anything in 2025, and now it's 2026, and I want to put money in 2025. Astute people will correct me and say, yeah, you actually can do that up until April 15th. Very true. But what I'm saying is that, let's say in 2027, you can't go back and say, in 2025, I didn't use that window. Can I stuff some money in there through the 2025 window? The answer is no. So you kind of want to take advantage of those annual windows as they're made available to you because they do close. They close on April 15th of the following year. So you can actually contribute to a prior year up until April 15th of the following year. But after that, that window does close. Now, the benefit is you're not really locking that money up per se, because technically you can get your contributions out of a Roth IRA at any time. No tax, no penalty. The contributions only, not the growth. So there's kind of no, I hate to use the word risk, but there's no downside in putting money into the Roth IRA and saying, you know what, if I put it in there, I'm never going to be able to get to it until I'm 59 and a half. That's not true, only for the earnings. But for the contributions, you can get them out at any time, no penalty, no tax. So that's a huge benefit. The window opens, you can put the money in there. You can also get it out at any time, contributions only. But once that window closes, you can't put any more money in it for that particular window. So I look at it as something to definitely consider taking advantage of, especially as a young person. Can you imagine having decades of tax-free compounding growth? It's phenomenal. When we get to the end of this episode, I'll talk a little bit about compounding. So hopefully that answers the question that we had raised at our meetup. And if you're listening out there, and I know you guys listen to the podcast, so maybe that's a little bit of additional food for thought. And hopefully you were able to accomplish what we had talked about. And I would say that if you have the wherewithal to be able to help young people either through matching or even just putting the money in the account, because here's the thing about putting money in the account. If an individual has the income, let's say a young individual makes $3,000 in the summer, but needs that money, they need it for school the next year or whatever, there's nothing that says that you can't put in that $3,000 into the account. You can basically give it to them, and then they put the money in without utilizing their own $3,000. That's certainly very generous, and I don't expect everyone to do that, but just keep in mind that that is an option. It doesn't actually have to be the dollars directly from their earnings. It's just the amount that they can contribute is limited to how much they've earned, or $7,000 maximum. So then it's interesting. I've gotten a number of emails, and I do really appreciate you sending them in. And this individual actually sent me 2 emails, and I'm going to answer, or try to address at least, the second of the 2 that they sent in, because I think it's relevant to this conversation. So this was sent in by Luke. Luke, thank you for sending this in. And I'm going to skip a little bit ahead, but he did say that he sent a previous question in about the fund bucket topic, and hopefully I can address that at some point in the future. But he says his daughter is graduating from college this year and has taken her first job offer as an engineer with a salary, which he mentions, but I'm just going to say that it's a very good salary. He continues, this feels like the perfect math equation where you could argue for either side. Her job offers a guaranteed 4% contribution to a retirement plan and then a 10% match on whatever she contributes to retirement. So if she contributed 10%, they would contribute an additional 1% for a total contribution of 15%, which is basically the 4% fixed contribution, her 10%, which is now 14%, and 10% of her 10%, which is 1% for a total of 15%. That's the math. I had to read it twice to how does that work? Okay, gotcha. He continues, she will be a single person with the standard deduction, so most of her salary will be in the 12% bracket. And I'm paraphrasing here. But some of her upper income will be in the 22% bracket. My question is, should I encourage her to contribute to her standard retirement account to achieve the additional 10%, and that means the match, the 10% match on her contribution, or should she contribute to a Roth IRA, since I think long-term she will not be in a low tax bracket? It seems that she should max out her HSA, and then after that, the question is if she should take advantage of the Roth for tax deferment. She is 22 and makes good financial decisions, but obviously I don't know what her long-term financial situation will be in the future with partners, children, etc., or if the 10% bonus is enough to justify going all in on the tax-deferred part. And then he goes on. So let's just stop right there and talk about that key element. My first question would be, does her employer offer a Roth option in the plan? And if they do, does the match also work there? Typically, if there's going to be a match, it doesn't matter if you select the Roth version or the traditional version, but the match itself is usually going to fall into the traditional portion of the plan. So in other words, she could, assuming they have both Roth and traditional 401k options, she could potentially contribute her 10% to the Roth piece, or Roth side. They would match the 4%, presumably in the traditional side, and then 10% of her 10%, which is 1% in the traditional side. That would be how I would expect most plans to be structured. So I would check on that. I do agree with you that it makes complete sense for her to contribute to the Roth side with her contributions. Being in the 22% bracket, even with part of her income, that's still a very low tax bracket historically. Even the next bracket, which is 24%, is still very low historically. My daughter had the same question, and I said, I would, as long as you're in the 24 or lower, my preference, personal preference, if it were me, would be to go Roth because of the tax-free compounding, and also our U.S. government is in need of funds at some point, so they're not going to be able to keep taxes low at this level forever. Eventually, we're all going to need to pay for some of these deficits that we're running. And so my guess would be, if I had to be a guessing person, taxes are more likely to go up than down. So go ahead and pay today's rate and be happy with it. The other thing is, I look back and say, I look at myself, for example, and I contributed a lot to traditional, and now I'm trying to figure out how to unwind some of that with conversions and things like that. But I also think about, if I had paid the tax way back when, I wouldn't be sitting here today saying, oh, I shouldn't have paid all that tax now. I'd be sitting here really happy that I had all this Roth money. And I'm trying to get there now with Roth conversions and things of the like. So I don't think anyone is going to kick themselves for paying the tax in those tax brackets. Now, for people who are in higher tax brackets in the 30s, let's say, and potentially looking at retiring in short order, yeah, it would make sense to defer in those high tax brackets. And then once you get into retirement, or at least a period where your income goes down, you could do conversions at lower rates. But for young people, I would say, personally, again, this is not advice, but if it were me and I were in the 24% bracket or lower, I would go Roth. So I don't know that it's a question of having to do a Roth IRA on the outside versus just using the Roth option at the employer. Now, if that's not the case and it's just a traditional version of a 401k with no Roth option, which would be kind of rare these days, but if that's the case, the 1% match may not really be as beneficial as potentially getting the money into a Roth IRA or into the Roth bucket via an IRA. So it's hard to say exactly, but if it were, 2-to-1 match, 5% on a 10% contribution, that'd be a different story. But if it's a 10% match on your contribution, I think it's maybe worthwhile to skip that in lieu of getting it into the Roth bucket. But again, I would guess that there is a Roth option at the 401k at her job. So definitely look into that. And that would be my preference if it was me to just use the Roth 401k, again, assuming the plan is a decent plan, has decent options, and the expense ratios are low and all the normal caveats. So thanks, Luke, for sending that question in. And your other question is pretty long. So I will hope to get to that at a future date, and I have some other questions that have come in. And if you would like to send a question into me, feel free to do that. You can send me an email at mark@marksmoneymind.com. And just do me a favor and put podcast question in the subject line, because it helps me kind of weed through other emails that I might receive. And I'll try to get to it on the show one of these days. So again, I really appreciate those of you who have sent in questions, and I will, now that I'm back, try to get to more of those. And that leaves me with my last piece today for the episode. Many of you may have heard, and I've spoken about Warren Buffett before on this podcast, but he has decided to retire. It was maybe a shock to many people. I think many people probably expected it at some point in time. Actually, I think most people expected that he would pass away in the seat that he holds, which is the CEO and chairman role at Berkshire Hathaway, and not give it up prior to his passing. Or the board, which he had instructed that if he were to lose his faculties or show signs of declining, that they were instructed to remove him. And, that could have been the case too at some point in time. Was not the case, but I could have seen that as a possibility. I don't think many people expected him to step aside, though. Now, he is 94 years old. He will be 95 years old in August, and he is still super sharp, as was Charlie Munger, his co-chairman. Charlie passed away at the end of 2023 at the age of 99. And man, he was sharp as a tack all the way up until the end. And the same with Warren Buffett. I don't know what they put in the water in Omaha, but man, those guys, super sharp. It probably helps to come from such a smart basis to begin with, so any decline is not noticeable to people like us who are not at their level. But Buffett basically decided to step aside and let Greg Abel take over the helm at the end of the year. He submitted his, in essence, resignation to the board, and they did accept it. The board decided that he should remain as chairman, but he will no longer be CEO at the end of the year. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting, and this came out a little bit later, is that every year Warren Buffett, and when he was alive, Charlie Munger, would sit up on the dais at the annual meeting and answer questions for hours on end. In the past few years, even while Charlie was still around, Greg Abel and Ajit Jain joined them up there to answer some questions. In the year after Munger passed away, Greg Abel and Ajit Jain also joined Buffett up there. But in the last week, Buffett announced that he would not be up on the dais next year. And I think that's great. He's really allowing Greg Abel to take the reins in full. So Greg will be the one up on the dais. I presume he will have Ajit Jain up there as well, potentially some other people. I don't know. And it's really a testament to kind of handing over the reins at Berkshire Hathaway. I think Buffett feels very confident that the company is in good hands, and he's ready to step aside and let Greg do his work at the business. He's been there for decades, so I think he's had a good test run, I guess you would say. Getting to the compounding aspect. This is what I think is so interesting. I just looked up some numbers before I pushed record here. And Berkshire Hathaway now has a market cap, which is the price of the shares times the number of shares outstanding, which basically determines the size of the company, of $1.16 trillion. That is massive. It is the 8th largest company in the United States now. And this all started from the purchase of a textile mill by Warren Buffett in, I believe it was 1965, so 60 years ago. And I think that's very interesting in that he stepped aside after the exact 60 years. He's kind of a round number guy. If you look at some of the holdings in the portfolio, you'll see they're very round numbers in many cases, or at least the ones that they hold for a long period of time. And he decided to step aside at 60. They also came out with a anniversary book, 60-year anniversary book, and I fortunately was able to get a copy. There was an individual who was there who was able to pick up a copy for me and send it to me. Thank you very much for doing that. I really appreciate it. And now that this has all happened, I am super happy that I got a copy of that book. And it shows kind of the 60 years of Berkshire Hathaway. There was one published 10 years ago, the 50 years, which I also have. So it's a nice complement to that book. Anyway, so basically grew from nothing in 1965 to be the 8th largest company today at $1.16 trillion. It's an amazing feat. And that's all at Buffett's while he was at the helm, basically. His personal net worth is now $160 billion. There are a handful of people that are wealthier, but all of his wealth was built through the ownership of shares in Berkshire Hathaway. And he also did not pay himself, or the company did not pay him very much. I believe his salary is about $100,000 a year. And then there's some extra costs for security and stuff like that. But basically, he's been paid $100,000 a year for his entire period that he's worked there, or at least the majority of the latest years, many of the latest decades. And so it's not because he's earning some huge, corporate salary. It's just because he's been an owner of the shares in the company. And what I think is very interesting, and this is kind of a testament to how compounding works. And I talk about this in the example of kind of the magic penny, a penny doubling every day for 30 days becomes over $5 million. But all of it really happens in the tail end. It doesn't cross $1 million until the 28th day. And it's very slow at the beginning. And that's how compounding works. So for people who have like a Roth IRA that are just opening it, most of your increase in value is because of your contributions as opposed to the gains. And then later, one of the crossover points is when the gains exceed what you contribute every year. That's always an amazing point in time. And then when the gains in the account exceed your salary, that's another huge one, which is just crazy crossover point, which is pretty cool to see. But if you look at Buffett's net worth, $160 billion, he didn't cross $1 billion. Now, of course, that's a huge number, until he was in his mid-50s. Think about that. He started investing in his 20s, somewhere around 20 years old. And 30 years later, he hits $1 billion. Awesome, by the way. I mean, Very few people could say that. I'm in my mid-50s. I don't have $1 billion. But anyway, it's really interesting that it wasn't until he was in his mid-50s that he crossed $1 billion. And then $10 billion, so 10 times as much, was in his mid-60s, only a decade later. And then $100 billion in his early 90s, and now $160 billion. So you can see that compounding is like this hockey stick that really gets crazy big at the end, or as I like to say, it's like a snowball rolling down the hill, gathering speed and size along the way. And I would like to say that I've been very fortunate in being able to go to the annual meetings every year for many years. I have not gone in the past few years. I was fortunate to be able to see it online, and anyone can. It's cnbc.com has it. I'll try to put the link to the most recent meeting there where he actually announced his retirement at the end. It was like a very short 5-minute, not even 5 minutes, like 2 minutes of his announcement with a standing ovation from the crowd that I believe lasted, I want to say, a number of minutes, 5 minutes or something. And I will put a link to that in the show notes so you can see it. But fortunately, I was able to see it online for the past few years. I was able to go for probably about 10 years, I think, and really learn a lot from Warren and Charlie in the way they answer questions, how they treat. They like to call them partners, not shareholders. And I would just like to thank Warren Buffett. I'm sure he's not listening to this podcast, but if by chance you are, thank you so much for everything you've taught me and numerous others. We are greatly, greatly appreciative. And we wish you all the best in your retirement. Welcome to the world of retirement. Anyway, that'll do it for this episode. And I hope to be publishing again on a more regular schedule as I am now back from my big trip. I will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's show. Please click follow on your favorite podcast player or subscribe on YouTube to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. Also, please leave a rating and review for the show. This helps improve the ranking and enables other like-minded people find the content in their podcast players. If you would like me to answer a question on the show, please send it to mark@marksmoneymind.com and put podcast question in the subject line. Let me know your first name or let me know if you would like to remain anonymous. I would also appreciate it if you would recommend this show to friends and family that might benefit from this content. See you next time on the Mark's Money Mind Show. Until then, make some, save and invest, live on the rest. Now for the all-important disclaimer. This show is for education and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered investment, tax, or legal advice. Please consult the appropriate advisor or advisors before implementing anything you hear on this show or any other show for that matter. While I fully intend for everything on this show to be true and accurate at the time of each recording, occasionally errors may occur. So please do your own due diligence on anything discussed.